So I think I will start. I'm Dan Esty. I'm a professor at Yale, and I am here on behalf of the Remaking Trade project, which is a network of researchers and policymakers around the world who have been meeting over the course of the last couple of years to think about restructuring of the trade system, in particular to give force to the first paragraph of the Marrakesh Agreement that launched the World Trade Organization, that I think many of you will know came into existence in 1995. And that first paragraph says, and I'm paraphrasing, that the trade system is not all about market opening and trade liberalization, that those are really just means to the end of sustainable development. And I will tell you my own personal journey here goes back quite a long time on that topic. Before there even was a WTO, I wrote a book called Greening the GATT, the Global Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. As I was just explaining to one of our speakers, Malaku, who was forced to read this book as a graduate student, that it has just come back into a second printing 30 years on from its original. He was kind enough to point out that I was ahead of my time. The alternative is that the arguments were not very compelling. And I'm going to stay with my friend and colleague here on the theory that the moment has come around, and the fact that you are all here reflects that. I am a professor at Yale for now 30 years. This was actually the ticket that got me invited to compete for a professorship at Yale, which at first I said no to, but then I realized maybe I should think about it. And one of those things that life happens, my wife and I went off to New Haven, Connecticut for what we thought would be 2 years, and 29 years later, we're still there. The trade system did launch the year after this book. That paragraph did get written about sustainable development. But I would say that the starting point for our conversation today is, have we really done what's required to implement a trade system that serves to deliver sustainability? And this Remaking Global Trade for a Sustainable Future project was organized with that question in mind. We have, over the last 2 years, had 10 workshops to address various aspects of the trade agenda and the sustainability agenda, beginning with issues like trade and climate change, looking at trade and a just transition to a clean energy future, trade in a digital economy, trade in a circular economy, sustainable agriculture and food systems, sustainable transport, finance for sustainable development. All of those are elements of the background work we did. Each of those workshops brought together 30, 40, and sometimes 50 thought leaders specific to the topic. And after 3 days of conversation, we extracted an agenda for trade system reform relevant to those specific issues. And that's what we pulled together into the document that is now called the Villars Framework. It's got that name because we vetted it in September with 110 high-level leaders from around the world who provided both a political and a substantive sort of check, from an academic point of view, a peer review of the package that was coming together. And we have just released, and you should all now have in your hands, the refined version based on absorbing 3 months of feedback since September. So this reflects the latest thinking, and it does try in a quite comprehensive way to talk through what would be required to move the trade system from where it is today to a sustainable future that was really delivering on that sustainable development promise. And I don't want to go through every detail. This, in fact, is an 8-page policymaker summary distilled from a 160-page report that, if you want to see, is at the QR code. And some of you probably do want to have, of all the audiences I probably talked to, this one has more people that might want to look at that 160-page version than most. So I encourage you to pick it up when you want. I would say that the core of the story, for those who don't even want to read 8 pages, is that the trade system has had some rough recent years. I would say the last couple of years, starting to see some momentum coming back together, but we could even say a rough couple of decades, as there was a pretty broad perception that the system had lost its political footing, had lost political support, had a lot of issues on which the public seemed crosswise, and a number of countries that began to pull back from trade broadly and began to see globalization as a problem rather than a promise. And in that regard, this is an attempt to rethink the foundations of the trade system, beginning with its economic underpinnings, And the argument of the team behind this, which again, a core team of a couple dozen, but 400 contributors to the various workshops and the ideas, of which I would say at least 10 of those 400 are in this room, which is nice to see. But it really was the idea that the trade system delivered enormously well in its first decades, from the 40s, 50s, 60s into the 70s, working on bringing tariffs down. Our view is that somewhere in the 80s and 90s, it went off track, reflecting some dynamics that were true in many countries, a big deregulatory agenda, a push towards what some call neoliberalism or market fundamentalism, and all of that began to come to be seen as less favorable in the years more recently. And so our argument is we should get back to a trade system closer to the one that Cordell Hull designed in the wake of World War II. Cordell Hull was the longest-serving American Secretary of State and actually made the argument for a trade system that would pull people together, give them a sense of common economic destiny, the potential for shared prosperity. And the theory was that would hold people together rather than having them fighting. The second half of the 20th century was much better than the first in that regard, and I think Cordell Hull gets credit. For those who know his story, he won not a Nobel Economics Prize, although he could have for his trade logic. He won the Nobel Peace Prize, and that does reflect the theory that this system actually worked more or less. Now, I would say Vladimir Putin has put a little dent in the theory, but it still looks like a better first half of the or second half of the 20th century than first half. But our view is that there's a further reform needed now. We need to get beyond the shift away from tariff reduction, which was the core success, which blended into non-tariff barrier reduction, some of which was legitimately taking out disguised barriers to trade. We'll pick on my speaker to the right. Canada famously, actually Ontario, made an argument that you could only serve beer in glass bottles, which had happened that Labatt's and Molson, the Canadian brews, were served in glass bottles. The argument was environmental. It was really designed to keep the aluminum canned beers from America out. So there were some disguised barriers to trade, but the truth was a lot of things attacked at that moment were actually environmental regulation, worker protections, and there was a perception the trade system had begun to overreach. So our argument is it's time to get back to a trade system that works for people, that is not designed simply to clear market opportunity for multinational corporations, and in that regard needs to promote sustainable development. And we would argue that the work of the trade system going forward needs to take a number of issues under focus, all of which are laid out here, 4 of which I'll highlight quickly and then move into a discussion. Number 1 is to recognize the overarching commitment of the world community to climate change action. So the trade system needs to become better aligned with that climate change commitment. Number 2 is that there is going to be challenges as countries come at the climate change conversation with different approaches. The US and Europe are clearly on quite different places in how they're going to advance this agenda. Europe advancing a carbon pricing regime that is now going to be internationalized through something called the CBAM, which I know many of you in this room are quite familiar with, the idea of a carbon border adjustment mechanism. But behind that, to make that work, are a whole set of standards. How do you measure greenhouse gases associated with traded goods? What's the right price to deploy? How do we accept equivalence across different approaches to climate change? Or, as the European Union is proposing, I think mistakenly, is it just a question of your explicit carbon price? So, alignment with climate change, standards to support sustainability. A third big issue is subsidies. The US, of course, is using a subsidy approach to climate change that a number of folks have found jarring. Although I would tell you what's interesting is how many countries have now announced that they're going to do similar kinds of industrial policy with a similar structure of subsidies. So it's not just the US. China, frankly, has been doing this for decades. India is very interested in this now. The European Union, at first having pushed back hard on the US, is now re-upping its own commitment to industrial policy through its Green Deal. South Africa has announced an interest in industrial policy. Brazil has. So I think the world is trending that direction. The question, what's the framework that ensures that you don't have subsidies that are unnecessarily jarring your trade partners? And our argument in the Villars Framework is let's not focus simply on trade distortion. Let's start with a different question, one that we think is brought to the fore by the Marrakesh Agreement mandate for sustainable development, and that is, what's the purpose of that government funding? And if it's sustainability enhancing, you have to treat it differently than if it's sustainability diminishing. Final kind of highlight to put on the table for discussion is the belief that the first three items need to be done in a way that takes seriously the development piece of sustainable development and asks the question, how do we accommodate the fact that some number of countries feel that the way the agendas are being pursued in the United States and Europe and elsewhere is going to simply hold them out of markets that they might have hoped to get into as part of their development. And I do think we want to ask the question, what's being done with the CBAM, what's being done in the United States and others with the subsidies to ensure that it's not becoming an obstacle to market access, but rather an encouragement for people to lift their standards and to create an inclusive, transparent trade system going forward. So I apologize to those who have heard this story before. Emily, I think, is on her 5th round of this. So I might have to adopt her as the next commentator because she probably is more prepared to comment than anyone else. But it is meant to say that I think this issue of remaking a trade system has now got enormous traction. And one of the joys of being in this space, and I thank IISD, Alice Topping, and the team that have put this together, is that the conversations we're having actually are the ones they should be having across the street, where people are pulling and pushing on each other, thinking together, and recognizing there's hard work to be done, but the people of goodwill and good spirit who are able to think together and come in with an open mind might actually make some progress. And I hope for today that we'll do some of that. I want to promise all of you that this Villars Framework remains a work in progress. You're being handed a document updated in the last 2 weeks after 3 months of feedback, but it remains something we're going to continue to refine, so everything you say will be recorded here today. I was meant to tell you that we're on camera, so there is no Chatham House rule. You're being recorded for posterity, so feel free to think about what you say in that regard. And I also want to say that we're enormously grateful to the speakers who've agreed to start our conversation. I'm going to give each of them 3 or 4 minutes to offer comments on what they think the movement towards a remade trade system might look like. They come from diverse perspectives, and this is an enormously interesting set of workshops that have gone on here yesterday and today. But I think we might win the prize for the longest distance that our speakers have come in total. And they're going to explain where they're coming from, but I think you will see that we're doing pretty well in terms of geographic diversity as well as perspective diversity. So with that, I'm going to stop and say thank you again to all of you for taking time out of your busy lives, busy day to be here. And I want to start with Malaku, who's from the African Trade Policy Center, and offer him a chance to start the conversation, and Tanya will follow, and Chantalin will take the final place.
Thank you very much, Professor Steve. Colleagues, I'm very, very pleased to be here, and thank you for the invitation to be here. My name is Malaku Desta. I come from the Africa Trade Policy Center, which is a unit within the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, based in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. When I was invited to be a discussant on this, I looked at the document, and of course, I read more than 8 pages, but not the entirety of 160 pages. So I'm going to share my thoughts on this. So I think the first thing to say, I think, is the document, the approach that you are leading. I think it raises the critical issues there, in the sense of not just sustainable development from the environmental angle, but also in all senses, the economic, the social, as well as the environmental, which I think is a fantastic approach. And then I think I was asked, I think, to comment particularly from the African perspective. And of course, the irony of it is, of course, is very clear. Africa was really not a contributor to the climate change challenges that we have. But Africa also suffers the worst consequence of climate change. As a result, Africa cannot bury its head and say, no, this is a problem caused by others, we cannot do anything. Africa is actually doing a lot in this area already within the limits of its own means. If you look at, for example, the Paris Accord commitments, I think on my last count, about 53 of the 54 UN member countries in Africa have their own national determined contributions, which I think says a lot in that sense. And now, how do we bring that into how do we inform the remaking project with Africa's interests? I think a lot of it has been covered in the document very, very well. The focus on integrating the SDGs into the project, looking at, for example, when I look at the SDGs, I always start with the top, of course, poverty and then hunger. These are the major challenges that we have in the continent. And I always believe that we have to, that ranking, I know it's an integrated whole, all 17, but that ranking, I think, means something. We are putting the top challenges first, poverty and hunger. So yes, environmental challenges can be existential, but poverty and hunger are even more immediate existential challenges for most Africans. So how do we address all the issues? I think into the trading system, I think that is a very, very important point. There is the issue of, in the context of climate change, we talk about the green transition and all that. And you look at the continent, it's very well endowed with the right type of resources, minerals for the green transition. Mm-hmm. But then the challenge is, the scramble for the resources now, the new scramble for the resources, will it result in something that's different, something that's new now? A lot of the African countries, they allow the resource to be dug out and exported. Imagine they introduce tomorrow a condition that, yes, for my development sake, there should be some kind of beneficiation taking place within the country. They will end up in a WTO court, possibly if they're lucky, just like what Indonesia did. But in many cases, these rules, the WTO rules that do not prohibit this kind of approaches, they don't have to be taken to court. They are a very powerful tool in the diplomatic engagements between between the African countries and the powerful nations. They will be used, invoked against them in all sorts of areas. In this kind of project, for example, I would have loved to see a recommendation that would say something like, yes, they can introduce conditions that are necessary for their development, for the realization of their development ambitions. Just like what we have, exceptions for environmental measures, for example, things that you have been working on forever done. So those are the kinds of things that I would have wanted to see in this kind of approach. Whether it would have, this kind of proposal would have passed closer scrutiny at the technical level, I don't know. But this is a kind of idea that I was hoping to see in the report. Let me stop there. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much. 5 seconds short of 4 minutes. Just perfect. Let me just say, I think this is very much in the spirit of the effort. And I do think it's sustainable development broadly defined. So I think certainly poverty alleviation programs, well within the bounds of what governments are free to pursue and should have space to pursue. And I think the idea of hunger being a priority, no one doubts. And I think if anyone thought that trade rules should be brought to bear against countries trying to advance that agenda, they should be disabused of that. But the system does need clarification. And I think how far you can go in some of the movement up the value chain to really capture not just the initial extraction of minerals, but more of the value added is a big question, and one that, again, I think you've got quite a lot of support for the idea it needs to be broader. So Tanya, tell us a little about where you're coming from, because you're going to be the reason we win our prize as the farthest distance that everyone's come. But we know you have an agenda behind that to share as well.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Esti, for the invitation to be part of this important conversation. And also in accordance with our tikanga etiquette and accordance with what we believe is right, I'd also like to acknowledge the mana whenua, the local people of the Emiratis, in particular His Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan and Crown Prince Sheikh Khalid bin Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan and the Emirati people for their hospitality and kindness in hosting us here on their lands. My name is Tanya Te Whenua, and I am from New Zealand, which is about I think 18 hours in total, the flight. So now you know. The most southern country in our world. I am here as, well, first of all, I will say that I'm a lawyer, and I always disclose that and apologise for that in advance. And that takes me to my position as the Deputy Chair of Te Taumata Māori Trade Board, which is an advisory board to the Ministry for Foreign Affairs and Trade within Aotearoa, New Zealand. Also, as a lawyer, I am the counsel to the Public Service Association Union, which is the union of the entire public service sector in Aotearoa, New Zealand, their Māori membership with respect to work issues and labour issues that inequitably affect Māori. And I am also the lawyer for the Council of Trade Unions in New Zealand on which their Māori membership again, Council of Trade Unions being the overall biggest umbrella union in our country. I am an executive committee member on the Board of Governance New Zealand Women on Boards, and I act for in a particular standing commission of inquiry which considers particularly Māori issues in a constitutional realm within Aotearoa, New Zealand. I act for claimants who have laid claims with respect to climate change. We laid the very first claim. Our claimants, we acted for them and they filed the first claim on climate change within our country. And I also act for claimants that, with respect to issues facing the breakdown of families and the welfare of children in our country. So I put that out there first because I am here to make comments on the social sustainability component of Villars. And I hope you can see from my background the areas that are of primary concern to me. They're not, our social framework as Māori are not distinct or removed from the environmental aspect, because absolutely we believe as Māori and Indigenous people resonate with this concept that we have a familial or social relationship with the natural environment around us as well. So with respect to the particular recommendations of Villars, which were to look at have an assessment exercise to look at distributional impacts of trade and ensure that all stakeholders are represented in the trade negotiations process. What we would say and what we see in New Zealand is that it must take place. I agree with the fact that an assessment is necessary, because what use is economic development if it doesn't take everybody along. And we have massive gaps and divide as a result of the current regimes. Within New Zealand and amongst Māori, we absolutely see this. We, on one hand, have a Māori economy that has been assessed and is thriving at a rate which greater exceeds that of the general economy within New Zealand. We're around about 900,000 people. Our economy was measured prudently at about 68 billion, which is not an insignificant amount, and actually something which we celebrate. At the same time, we're 17.5% of the population within New Zealand. We are 50% of the homelessness population in our own country. We are 50% of the unemployed population in our country. We're up to 68% of the imprisoned population in our country. Our life expectancy continues to be lesser than the general population. And with respect to health, in particular mental well-being, our youth have the highest suicide rates in the OECD, not just in New Zealand. So you can see how important the idea of social sustainability in an economic development framework is for us. With respect to targeted activities, so the assessment is necessary, and then what's the outcome of that? What can we see? What are some practical tools that we see happening that can give effect to better closing of the gaps? And within New Zealand, we have a Trade for All advisory board, which looks at distributing the benefits policy that can distribute the benefits better to all New Zealanders, which actually a number of my team members are on, including Carrie Stoddard-Smith, who leads the Aotearoa New Zealand delegation, alongside Nahiwi sitting here to my right, to WTO and IISD, and also my chair on the Taumata board, Hone McGregor. So they're on the Trade for All board, and Māori are having a contribution. So we say an assessment is fine, but we also need to be at the table at the moments of those, not only the assessment, but when co-developing and co-designing the solutions. Another mechanism which we have in New Zealand is a wellbeing framework, which takes a multiple bottom line look at development and the benefits of development, not just GDP anymore. We're looking at wellbeing standards across New Zealanders as a measure of how effectively trade is being distributed within our country. And finally, another excellent example, I think, is the Taumata board itself, and that of Ngā Toki Whakarururanga and other advisors also, including Ngāhiwi Tomoana, who is here present right at the end there, our pakeke, who directly advise our Ministry for Foreign Affairs and Trade on policy negotiations at the international level, and also our particular perspectives and how they will affect us, so that we can co-design and properly achieve better outcomes for Māori. One other thing that we do have is we're working directly with our Trade and Enterprise Agency to give effect to Māori-specific implementation of these free trade agreements, so that we're all getting the benefits of what has been agreed to. And we also have a staggered tax system in New Zealand. For example, Māori authorities are taxed at a lesser rate than general business, which is 30%, Māori authorities 17.5%, the lowest individual tax rate 17%. So you can see the tax system potentially is something also that I have been numerously on multiple occasions here that could be we need to take a closer look at that at a global level, and potentially a more equitable tax system, not only for those who may be starting up and maybe need some concessions, but also for those who are most wealthy and have the ability to avoid tax at the moment due to the way that the regime works.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
That is enormously helpful in covering really a whole range of the social dimensions that we need to put into the conversation. I'm really awed by how many of these issues you've already begun to take up and think about in the Maori context. And it does strike me that you've now also begun to create links to other indigenous communities to compare notes on what the best practices and policy tools might be. So that is really helpful. And, I feel like of all the areas of sustainability that are under discussion, some of them are very mature. Again, having opened with the idea that the environment's been in discussion for 30 years, but these social dimensions are much newer. So there's a lot of work to be done on the gender issues, on the worker issues, on the labor rights issues, on the public health issues, on the equity questions. And I do think your movement from the problem to the tools is very helpful, because I fear that some of the conversation has gotten stuck with identifying the issue, and we failed to think about what is the leverage that the policy system might provide to help move us towards solutions. With that, Chantaline, I turn to you, one of the longtime partners of this project. We celebrate your role, having in the last year moved to UNCTAD to lead this conversation on an ongoing basis. And thank you for your contributions over the past now almost 2 years.
Well, thank you, Dan, and thank you for the previous two speakers. And I must report as a Canadian that the situation is as bad for our Indigenous people in Canada. So it's across the board. And as a major group coordinator for the Rio Plus 20 and the SDGs, I must say that the Indigenous peoples were really active. And one of the major issues was that, all of our trade system and trade law is based on individualism, and while the Indigenous people is often on collectivism. And so how do you bring these two together? And we haven't done that yet. Though last year we did pass a resolution, last year in the General Assembly on social and solidarity economy that look at the collective. And so hopefully with these new economic models, we can merge them with the blue, the circular, the green economy, and then you can match the social and the environmental. So I think first, thank you, Dan, for taking up this major task of bringing all the stakeholders together. I think this is something that really needs to be done, and also for not just being humoring us, but actually taking our input into account and revising this document. Often we get told that this input will be taken into account, but it's not quite the reality. So thank you for that. And I was a bit harsh on you sometimes, but these were taken into account. So that's and what I would like to add perhaps is I feel that since Rio and the SDGs that the voice of the civil society has declined into these intergovernmental processes. After COVID, there's been a breakdown on the voice of our civil society. And with Marcus over there, yesterday we were thinking in the NAFTA we have this citizen petition process, and in the human rights process we have the shadow assessment, right? That the civil society can produce their own assessment of the assessment of their government. And so we should consider something like this in the multilateral security system, where citizens bring to the fore the fact that my country is saying they're doing that, but and they're saying they have in my account a feminist policy. Okay, so if in another area we're actually destroying the business opportunity of women agricultural farmers, then maybe our development policy is not as feminist after all. So to have this balance, because I feel that sometimes the impact assessments are done and they're discussed and then there's not much that is done afterwards. So perhaps that would be a way to operationalize them. Another builds a bit of what Melaku was mentioning, and you mentioned it, Dan, this whole idea of the subsidies. There are subsidies and there are subsidies, right? So the U.S. is the largest economy, well, is it still the largest economy? Yeah. In the world.
For another few weeks.
Yeah, and can print money. That's the difference between a lot of us. And therefore can subsidize at a level that is not possible for other countries. And so it's not just which subsidies are good for the environment, disruptive. Can we take into account the development impact spillover effect on especially the comparative advantage of developing countries? And perhaps there need to be an added column to your matrix. I don't know if it would be a row or a column, but it would have a development angle, right? And so is it taking away, is it adding to is the global good larger than the global cost? So if it's increasing the cost of solar panel for the entire planet and therefore it's speeding up the picking up of renewable energy, but at the same time it's destroying the potential renewable energy capacity for Africa. How do you balance these two? And we don't really do that right now. With ECA, we're looking at the comparative advantage of, for instance, Africa on these goods and services. It's important that these comparative advantage remain because we can't really tell them, oh, you have to be on board on environment and trade, and then whenever there's a comparative advantage, cut it off from them, either because of market access, because of the CBAM, or because of subsidies in the case of the USAID. I think on the fishing recommendation, you're right on. We're very happy that we're going to be, and then now I'm moving more with where UNCTAD could help you. Because you said now you're trying to bring that region into partners. We're partnering with France and Costa Rica to host the Third Ocean Conference, and we really hope that whatever comes out here needs to be brought there. And then we're going to focus on the financing of the blue economy. And so, we would like to see how we can partner with others on that. We're also working with Ngozi's team on the pricing of carbon task force. So this is another area that we should bring everybody together. But we also need to, I'm going to try to use another word, to go to go down to the national level and measure, because each country will have their own comparative advantage, their own synergies with the SDGs and climate and trade policies and their trade-offs. And we need to go down to that level, something I've been talking with Assad, colleague from UNEP here, and then to look at what are the policies that are needed at the national level, but also international level. And then, because there are unprecedented co-creation that are needed here, please continue this effort and of bringing us together, but also farm out some of these pieces to some of us so that we can take it on. For instance, UNCTAD has several intergovernmental expert groups on financing for development, on digital economy, on consumer protection, competition. One could be on trade and climate and environment, where we look at some of these issues before negotiators put their negotiating hat on.
Great. All right, well, this has put an enormous amount on the table. I'm going to start inviting any of you who have a comment or a question. We're going to keep it lively, invite you to make that crisp and focused. And if anyone starts to give a speech, we'll cut them off. But a crisp or focused comment or question would be very valuable. And I think we'll save up a few and then come back and invite our speakers to comment on them. And with that, if anyone would like to start the process, please. And if you could tell us who you are, where you're from, and give us just a little bit of context, that would be great.
I'm Emmanuel Wachendro from the Institute of Economic Affairs Kenya. It's a Kenyan think tank, and I'm the Program Officer in International Trade and Development. So, salam no Nemako Desta. So,
That's Amharic for how are you?
yeah. So my question actually is, are any of you concerned about the relationship between, how governance mechanisms transmit our ambitions at the local and the global stage for both poverty reduction and climate rights engagement? So, are you concerned that more governments can actually hamper these movements, and how do you propose that we move forward, including civil society playing a more responsible and more creative role in that? Thank you.
Great question. Very helpful, please.
Dan, Phil O'Reilly, you'll hear from the accent. I also took the 18-hour flight from New Zealand to be here. I'm previously chairman of
We're
business.
just running out our strength of the diverse program
Speaking
here.
of climate change, so I used to be chairman of business at OECD. I've had a long history in trade policy discussions from a business community perspective. I read this from the perspective of a small, open, advanced economy. There's still a few of us left. And I look at what's going on in trade policy right now, and it's a return to might is right. It's CBAMs to me as might is right. ERA as might is right. And interestingly, you said the subsidies that people are following the US on. You mentioned all G20 economies in the EU, so no small countries can afford to do this. And small countries can't afford to do trade remedies either, because last time I looked, the WTO process doesn't work. So when I look at your 8 pages, look at the 8 pages that's the result of long, hard work, I think a lot of that is absolutely in line with the kind of thinking that the small, open, advanced economy and the business communities of the globe would like. So my question is twofold. Firstly, what's in it for small, open, advanced economies? Because a lot of when you think about sustainability subsidies, and you mentioned it yesterday in your session, what I hear of is trade protection. I hear that it's just another excuse for trade protection, right? So what is there in this for small, open, advanced economies? Second question, actually raised a little by the previous speaker. What's the role? Have you taken sufficient account of the role for what we might call complementary policies? So simply things like social protection, anti-corruption, good investment policies, internal education systems, infrastructure, and so on. Because trade often gets a bit of blame for all the problems of the world, and actually those things we need to focus on as well. So those are 2 questions for you.
Great. Thank you.
I have.
Please jump in.
Yeah. So very quickly, the 3 issues I wanted
Please
to take.
introduce yourself.
Oh, sorry. I'm Anuradha. I'm a lawyer based in Delhi, and I focus on trade sustainability and environmental issues. And I wanted to pick on the 3 aspects. One on the whole issue of carbon pricing. Chantal, it's excellent that you're working with the WTO on this, and the point that you mentioned, which actually links with what Melaku said in terms of the relevance of NDCs in determining what is carbon pricing, because there's not going to be a uniform carbon pricing worldwide. And the entire value of CBAM is going to depend on how it accounts for the differential. So that's one aspect which definitely needs to be considered. Second, Dan, the point, and I think Chantal covered this in terms of the objective of a subsidy, the extent to which that should be considered. Just to give one small example, we've seen that in the AU, the Agreement on Agriculture, the Green Box, and we see that 65 to 75% of value of production of subsidies by developed countries, falls under Green Box, but not necessarily non-trade distorting. So that is a larger part of the debate. That 3rd or 4th column that you may want to add in terms of what are the tests for sustainability in actually making this really work. And then the other issue in terms of what Tanya spoke about in terms of a number of aspects that needs to be done domestically by any country, and what you said holds relevance not just in your country but across the world for smaller marginalized economies. To what extent can rules of trade, when this is more of an internal specialized issue, what extent do rules of trade have to play in that? Is that really a sustainability assessment for each government internally, or can it have a multilateral framework?
Very helpful. Jane, I see you. Yes, I did.
Thank you so much, Ben. And thanks to all the speakers. I'm Jane Narunga. I work for an organization called C13, based in Uganda. My comment was to my brother Miller regarding the challenges facing the continent. You said the challenges are poverty and hunger, but poverty and hunger symptoms. We need to address the core causes of hunger and poverty. Because if we look at poverty and hunger as the challenges, it will determine the way we are going to remake and reshape and rethink trade. Thank you.
Right here. Thanks.
Thanks, Daniel. Damiana Bakirjeva from the Emirates Diplomatic Academy. I know we're all here because of the WTO and because of what's happening on the other side of the street. But if we just take a look at the first half of your title of the session, Remaking the Global Trade System, and since we all cannot ignore the fact that fragmentation is happening and that the WTO needs reforming and it's not perfectly working as of today, do you see any value in including sustainability at the trade negotiations at the bilateral level or at the minilateral level? The UAE is currently signing about 30 CEPA, which is Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreements. On a bilateral level, they're joining the BRICS. So we're looking at alternative ways of joining the trade system. How do we bring sustainability in that discourse?
Great. Very helpful. We'll take one more, and then I'm going to invite our commentators to give answers to any of the questions they want, and then we'll do a further round of questions if we've got time.
Thank you very much. My name is Rangavel Lachemezad from an organization called CRTINI, Southern and Eastern African Trade Information and Negotiation Institute, and I'm based in Harare, Zimbabwe. And I'm directing my question to Tanya. I like the well-being framework that you talked about, and I'm taking from where you left actually. To what extent the framework takes into consideration also like the regional trade agreements that you have, and also the SDGs, whether it links all these issues together within obviously the context of the multilateral trading system. Thank you.
Well, I want to just say thank you to all you who've asked questions, sharply focused, and given us a chance to dive in. Shatalin and I have a little joke because she wants us to get to the nitty-gritty, which is what you just have done, although she said it in another session that I thought she said needy-greedy. And we do have to address the needy and the greedy as well. But, so I appreciated her giving us a broad view of the issues that were in front of us. But I want to invite our speakers to address any of these issues. So, Rocky, do you want to start with any of the issues you want to address?
Sure. Thank you very much, Dan. I think let me start by agreeing with Jane, of course. There are symptoms, but there is a product of a very structural challenges that we have. And I think the multilateral trading system is part of that structure. And that's the context in which I read them. And we talk about the environment, the climate change, etc. Probably one of the best ways to address environmental issues, the physical environment, physical degradation of the environment, I believe, is to address poverty first. So it is that context that I mentioned. Otherwise, I agree with you completely. And of course, Emmanuel, the comment that you made about the role of the governance in the Africa Trade Policy Center that I'm heading, we spend 80% of our time just working on the African continental free trade area. And we know it can be transformational, but the one issue that we have right now is will it be implemented in the way that it should be? And that's an issue of governance, that's an issue of capacity and everything else. The issue of subsidies has come up here and there. And you can go back into history, and you mentioned you've done about the subsidies provided by the Chinese government, for example, and the new ones that are now coming, everybody's adopting them. The way I see it, and here you can call me cynical, they are about protecting jobs and the economy rather than the environment in many cases. And I think that we have to be honest and face it. In this kind of situation, our colleague from New Zealand here, he raised the issue of how New Zealand is not able to compete with the major economies in terms of subsidization. Now, imagine an African country competing with subsidization. So, historically, we know, even in agriculture, which is covered in the report very well, tax-paying farmers are competing with subsidized, exporters all across the world. This is the history of it. When you talk about poverty, it doesn't just exist, in a vacuum. There is a structure around it. So I think ultimately, all the conversations that we are having, they have to be guided by an honest, admission, acknowledgement of the issues behind. We talk about CBAM. Is it a tool for disguised restriction protectionism, rather than really addressing the core issues? We talk about subsidies. Is it about jobs or about the environment? Maybe it's about both, but I sometimes wonder which one is more important than which. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Tanya.
Thank you. I'll start by answering out my colleagues' and friends' question here, which I think was about the degree to which global rules should be leveraged in order to meet some of the social sustainability concerns, or whether it rests with a domestic regulatory regime. And I have to disclose again, first and foremost, that I'm an eternal optimist and an aggressive optimist as well, and often, poo-pooed for such kind of grandiose thinking. But I believe Dan was in 1995 as well, 1994, 30 years ago, in a similar position with respect to greening trade systems. And so I believe at that point where I do think that we can, if we take what is being proposed with respect to the environment and the reform specific recommendations within the Villars report, what is stopping us from transferring those over to socially sustainable measurements as well? For example, if we just take the pay gap and fair labour mechanisms, and we can accredit that system or certify that system in some way, what's stopping us from doing so and then encouraging countries to align their domestic policies to agreements which they've formed at an international level? Because, again, the pay gap is often touted as a gender inequity, but within Aotearoa New Zealand and across the board, what we see is the real pay gap that goes non-Indigenous men, non-Indigenous women, and then Indigenous men and Indigenous women, such that within New Zealand, the pay gap between Indigenous women and non-Indigenous men is twice that of non-Indigenous men and non-Indigenous women. So we need to, again, leverage the mechanisms that we have, and I believe it's a global responsibility as well as a domestic one.
Very helpful. Gentlemen, what would you like to say?
Maybe I'll pick up on what Tanya was responding. Data and modeling is really what we're going to have to rely on. I mean, if you look at business right now, they're focusing on green because it's easy. We have indicators. We have we can do it. It's really hard on social. We don't have. It's easy to measure. Are you increasing renewable energy or energy efficiency or water use? But social, how do you measure that as a business you're reducing inequality, that you are generally, or that you are fomenting development? I mean, these are really hard, and we don't have. So we need to speed up. I totally agree with you, and also I'm a confirmed optimist. But we need to speed up our progress. And we can do that by working together closely. And this is why I was so happy that Dan brought people together. So I think, and we've partnered, for instance, with McKinsey Global Institute and Sustainability on a model to actually do that, to measure social, key indicators on social and environmental issues and see where there's trade-offs, as I mentioned earlier. And we want to test this in 5 countries this year, bring it to COP, and then try to see if we can roll that up and keep that pushing and keep improving the model. It's not perfect, but perfection should not stop us from moving. We should start moving, walking, and then correct course as we go. Finally, on the carbon pricing, we took 3 sessions. It's the OECD, World Bank, IMF, UNCTAD, of course, led by WTO, and now UNFCCC have joined. And 3 sessions before we agreed on what the report's going to be. But now we've agreed, and the whole issue was how do you the equivalency? Not everybody's choosing carbon pricing. Dan mentioned that in the US they like carbon trading, they like subsidies. Different countries will use, and many countries can't use subsidies. So how do you account for that? So we now have an agreement on how we're going to go forward and how we're going to reuse that to show, and then it goes back to dialogue and trust, which we need right now because you were talking about the geopolitics and the breakout. And so we need the data, then we need to sit together with the empirical data to discuss instead of discussing at that level. Then it builds trust, then we can co-create solutions, I believe. And finally, on, again, your question, we're working closely on South-South trade in environmental goods for developing countries. Because if you look at Africa, for instance, there's a lot of potential, but perhaps each African country does not have the capacity to develop its own supply chain, its own of renewable, or one solar or wind or whatever. But together in a region, they probably can. And we've actually documented that they can. So a lot can be done in terms of growing, incubating this industry at the regional level, especially within the context of ACFTA, then that before we take on the world, right?
Great. So I will just pick up a little bit where Jotalin left off. I have concluded in the process of 30 years of trying to remake the trade system that one has to also embrace messiness. The system is messy, politics is messy, economic theory is beautiful, but it doesn't translate well to reality. So if you get stuck in a theoretical, beautiful world, you get lost when it comes to reality. So I think a number of the questions you all have raised is about how we translate into this imperfect world in which we must live. And I will start with my view that we face a really big threat right now. And that is that the system, carefully constructed in the wake of World War II, as I said, could fracture. And everyone talks about a north-south divide. I actually am not worried about that. This room represents, I think, bridging of gaps in an important way. I'm worried about a new east-west divide and a fundamental break that makes it hard to address a lot of the sustainability agenda. I see no way you get to a climate change solution if we pulled apart and we have a Russia-China bloc in one corner and a US-Europe and other friends in another corner. So I'm very worried about that. And I do think that means that all of us have to accept messiness to try to hold people together, recognize there are going to be different choices in different places. So just to pick up a few questions, Emmanuel, you're quite right to remind us that governance matters. In some ways, this is all second order. If you have breakdowns before that, if you have corruption, if you have problems, then we don't even get to the conversation we wanted to have. And to the question about New Zealand and others in that domain, I do think that this remaking trade vision has a lot of space. And in particular, what it's calling for is a central mission around sustainable development, but then a structure to ensure that pursuit of that in diverse and messy ways doesn't unnecessarily jar trade partners. And if anyone who's interested, there's an article I've just had published in the last week with a colleague named Elena Chima in the Journal of International Economic Law that goes into the depth and detail that maybe you want, which we probably can't get to. But let me just say, in our view, the first question around subsidies needs to be, is it sustainability enhancing or not? Second question, is it trade distorting or not? And that creates a 2x2 matrix. And some of the subsidies will be sustainability positive, not trade disruptive, and we say let those go. There's another category that's sustainability positive. These are probably the ones you're worried about, but trade disruptive. And then in that category, we would say that you need to have disciplines. It needs to be transparent. It needs to be, the subsidy needs to be explained and have a logical rationale. It needs to be demonstrated to be effective and not just greenwashing, not just green talk. It needs to have a proportionality test that environmental or sustainability gains must be much bigger than the trade losses. And finally, we would argue that it should not be leading to a market-dominant players. The word is not quite right, but there shouldn't be predatory practices in place. And I do think this is going to be useful to have that conversation. And I want to also just say to a number of you in response to several other questions, I think the movement towards a sustainability-framed global economy is helpful, not harmful to most of the developing world. And that a significant number of developing countries are actually going to find themselves advantaged as sustainability becomes a defining condition for participation in international traded goods. And there's work being done at the WTO There's a great new lead economist there named Ralph Assa who's doing work on green competitiveness. And what he has found is that as sustainability becomes a defining condition, certain regions are systematically likely to be advantaged. By the way, this doesn't wipe out all the historic advantages of investments in human capital and access to actual capital and technology, but the sustainability is first and foremost going to help Africa and second Latin America. And so in a number of places I've seen recently, African leaders in particular, but some as well in Latin America, starting to say, okay, bring it on. Let's make sure the rules are fair, but let's not just say no to a CBAM. It may be that a properly structured sustainability set of expectations, whether formed like a CBAM or in other ways, will actually be helpful to development. So we've got a few minutes left, but not a lot. So I want to see if we can get 2 or 3 more questions quickly on the table, and then we'll have a minute each for our speakers to close out. All right, maybe we have no more questions. So, all right, I'm going to get other people in the conversation first. Question? No, all right.
I can.
All right, Emily.
It won't be.
Okay, good.
It won't be new to you, Dan, but I've listened to you 5 times, so you'll have to hear my same remark again. But yeah, I think that.
Tell us who you are.
Yeah, I'm Emily
Emily.
from E3G, independent climate think tank with a global outlook. I'm personally based in Brussels, but we have a few different offices. And I've heard this pitch a couple of times, and every time I learn more, which is fantastic. But I also think more about the how and the resourcing of it all. So, I wouldn't say that the current training system is simple, but relatively to what this proposes, it is simple and not as resource intensive. So, my first question is who and how is going to make this happen financially, resources wise, infrastructure wise, and then the second one I think is the political question. We've seen this week at the WTO that there's kind of this doom and gloom undercurrent to everything we're trying to accomplish. So when I look at these outcomes, I think they're fantastic ideas, but I almost wonder, what are the baby steps to get there? If we can't adopt a proposal for the development of WTO approach to subsidies, can we establish a working group? Is that a more feasible step? And can we recognize those steps to get towards the ideas that are in the framework? So yeah, I think you have the law and the rules that we want to see. You have kind of the policy, but the politics also need to be included.
We'll get people to answer that question. One more, and then we'll jump back in.
Thank you so much. So, fully agree with your 4 points initially.
First, tell us who you are.
Yeah, thank you. Oh, my name is Asad Naqvi. I work for UN's Environment Program. I'm head of the Economic and Trade Policy team. So I agree with your 4 points. Fully endorse that there are challenges because of different approaches. And that's where I think one action that we can take is to find a pattern in that chaos and bring that pattern as the uniting force. Because I do say there are common things even in these different approaches. That is one thing. The second, probably what Emily has already said. I think we had enough discussion. Tell us this is what you need to do, and this is what UN needs to do, and this is what the civil society needs to do. And you will find people who are passionate about remaking the global trade system, and they will come forward. So,
great.
Marching orders.
Those are excellent questions that give us a chance to move the conversation forward. And given limited time, it's not even a minute each. So, Malaku, 45 seconds, or do you want to go second? We'll let Tanya go first.
Okay.
All right.
Marching orders, what can we do? This is a comment that I promised I would make on behalf of a good friend at the OECD. I think low-hanging fruit, the easiest thing first, why not a tax treaty? It's a joke. Fair and just redistribution of wealth. How about that as an action?
That is a beautifully done statement, and with a little humor, but not entirely a joke. Good.
No, thank you. I think this is a great conversation. I'm delighted that you are leading us, Dan. And the only thing that I would say, and I agree entirely with you, that the sustainability-centered trading system will be helpful for everybody, Africa included. Let's bring the economic development aspect of sustainability a bit more. That will be my message. Thank you very much.
Quickly, I think I agree with what Emily and Essa said. We need to get going, act. So happy to help. And if you see, I've said what UNCTAD can do, and we can, you tell us what else we can do to help. And we need to be optimistic because we're probably not going to have groundbreaking news from across the street. But it's election year. You've mentioned that before. I think we just need to keep plugging along.
Well, you did great to give me 45 seconds as well. So here's my thought. I think the commitment needs to be clear across the street, and I hope some of you with connections to governments that might be wobbling on this. We should reiterate the Marrakesh mandate for sustainable development at the heart of the system. Second, I would say we should seek some kind of climate change alignment, simply to say that the governments want the trade system to operate in a way that reinforces and supports the 166 members who have committed to the Paris Agreement and the idea of nationally determined contributions. So simply say we want the trade system to help countries meet those climate change commitments. And third, I think the answer to Emily, what you hinted yourself, is let's have work streams where we can't get the job done. Work stream on agriculture. Seems modest perhaps, but it's actually important. It would actually help us move forward. A work stream on standards to support the carbon pricing and other approaches, that would be helpful. And I do think my own favorite in response to how do we get the developing countries taken more seriously in their agenda, I think there is one of our recommendations in the Villars Framework is that the International Trade Center be repurposed and rechartered as a sustainable trade center. And that the mission to help small and middle-sized enterprises in the developing world not only get ready for trade by learning how to do customs and tariff classifications, but to meet sustainability standards would go a long way towards the European Union's seemingly not addressing whether their CBAM is going to hold people out of the market or lift people up to meet the standard. So if you really had a new entity funded appropriately to help companies meet the standards as opposed to keep them out of the marketplace, I think that would be a big first step. And I believe there's a lot of momentum behind that, including from the leadership of the ITC. They see this as regearing for a 21st century agenda that would be energizing to them and important. So I'm going to close on behalf of the Remaking Trade Project. And I do want to salute my colleague Genevieve Remy at the University of the West Indies, Joel Trackman at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, Tufts University, who can't be here but wanted to be part of it. I'm glad we have recorded this so they can see it. I do want to say to any of you who are interested, this is a project ongoing. The three of us will be carrying it forward in the months ahead. Our hope is to do 10 regional dialogues. Some of you I'm going to try to catch on the way out the door to see if you can host in your country or your city or come to one nearby. And again, I'm very eager for any of you who are doing analytic work to get a hold of it and to share it. We have an online library at the Remaking Trade Project website, and I would love to benefit from all that you are doing. And I guess the final thing, which several of you said, but I just want to hold it up at the last moment, is that this won't go forward unless we continue to have these conversations. And I want to thank you for contributing into what was, for a short hour, an enormously substantive discussion that covered a lot of ground. So thank you all very much.
Thank you.